Very good. So we're going to be learning higher order components. All right. For this, we're going to do this in the context of the Instaclone project you have been working on this week. And what we're going to do is you're going to build, in your afternoon project, you're going to build a login page with a username and password field. When you click login, when you click the button or submit the form, it's going to save some value to local storage. And then we have to either force an update or refresh the page. And when we do that, your higher order component will check local storage to see if you have that value stored in local storage, meaning if you have logged in, that value is there on local storage, and it will display the posts page rather than the login page. If you delete that value out of local storage, then that value is no longer there, aka the user is not logged in, and it will display the login page. So that's what we're going to be doing to practice higher order components today. That is one of the patterns that we use higher order components for. There's a couple different reasons we use higher order components. And one is to conditionally render different content. Another pattern is that we might use higher order components for is to extend shared functionality between 5 different components or however many components. So if you have 5 different components that you have built and you notice that you're rewriting a lot of the same logic inside those components, you can pull that shared logic out of those 5 components, build that into a higher order component, and then pass those components kind of through this higher order component machine. And for every component that gets passed into a higher order component, it will extend that shared logic back into that component. So instead of writing that logic 5 times, you wrote it once in your higher order component, and it will share that logic to those 5 components. Those are kind of the big use cases for HOCs. Today we're going to be practicing conditionally rendering in your projects. We'll take a look at kind of both situations in this lecture time though. All right, so let's talk about let's do this. We're going to open up a Replit, and I just want you guys to watch, and I'm going to be asking some questions. So we'll jump to Slack here in a minute. Oh, we're going to try something new. This is going to be fun. And I'm hoping that this is not going to cause a mass mutiny. So bear with me. We're going to experiment with this today, and then you guys can let me know what you think. But I want to try not having a questions thread. Oh no, no question thread. There's a specific reason for this. So hear me out before you attack. What I want to do is I'd like to hold all of our questions and conversations right here on our main channel. I know, thank you, Lucas. And then if you have a question, we're still going to use the red question mark so I can see this. And you say, this is my question. Now, I will be looking for red question marks, but at the same time, we're going to have some PMs here, oh, look at this, that are going to be helping me answer questions in threads, like this. So we want to try this out so that we can thread off of questions instead of coming into here and saying, at Lucas, the answer to there is here. So if Lucas had asked a question, then 5 comments down, we get an answer. It's a little incongruous. Incongruous? I don't know what that word is. It's just hard to relate this back to this question. So I think this is going to be a good a good flow here. So yes, part of this is to try and keep WEB17 as clean as we can during this lecture time, and use the chat channel for spamming, for silly stuff. Cool. So let's try that today. If it doesn't work, hey, we tried it, and we will revert back tomorrow. All right. Let's see what we're going to do today. What are we going to do today? HOCs. To start, one of the things that throws off a lot of people with higher order components is it's weird syntax that you haven't seen before. And we hear all the time that it's this super advanced, tough thing to learn. And so we just kind of overcomplicate things in our mind. We forget some of the fundamentals of JavaScript. That when you look at a line of code, when you look at how a higher order component is written out, I promise you, you can break down every line of code and know exactly what's going on. But we overcomplicate things and we forget that, oh, this is just JavaScript. When I invoke a function, it's going to return something. When I can return a function out of a function, higher order components return components out of functions. So we're going to go through all of that and hopefully set you up to recognize the syntax fairly quickly, and then bring it back down to the fundamental level of I'm invoking a function and it's going to return something, some value. Okay, to start out, we want to say, let's write a function called return 42. Now let's call it, we'll just call it number. And this function returns 42. Okay, simple function. If we invoke it, we're going to return 42. This is the same as something like const number return 42, right? We understand that. We've seen lots of arrow functions now. This could also be written like this. Const number equals a function, like that. Okay? These are all the same exact thing. They're all going to compile down to basically this, but they're all the same thing. It's a function called number that when it's invoked returns the number 42. What is important here is this last line. When we have an arrow function, a one-line arrow function, we've got this implicit return. So implicit return. Let's see, implicitly returning 42. That's better. Implicitly. So if I comment these out, and if I comment these out and I run this and I invoke number, it's going to return 42 implicitly from here. So whatever's to the right of my arrow is the return from this function. Remember that for later, because this is going to be really important today. Whatever is to the right of my arrow function is what's being returned. All right. Similarly, we can do something like function person returns an object. We don't have to return just a simple number or something. We can return something a little more complicated. If we pass in a name here, we can pass in an argument. The value that gets passed in when person is invoked is the value of this name property here. So same thing with our arrow functions. Let's take away the parentheses. We can do return the same object out of this. Okay, so we've got two of the same functions here. We can even make this one a one-liner as well. Now, when we want to do an implicit return with an object, we can't start with our curly braces. We can't do this because this function now thinks that this is the body of the function and not the curly braces of the object. It thinks it's these functions here, or these curly braces here. So if we want to implicitly return an object, we have to wrap it in parentheses. Okay, easy peasy, right? This is stuff that we recognizing. What if we wanted to do, let's just comment all this out. What if we wanted to do something like, ooh, what if we're going to pass in a function as an argument? Whoa. And then when we invoke, execute, pass in a function, that function will get invoked immediately. Right? So let's do this. Execute, we're going to pass in a function. Like that. We run this and we get our function invoked because we passed it in and then we invoked it inside execute. Some func is not a function. Oh, alert. I meant to do this. It just invoked it from there. That's what I meant to do. We're passing in this as the function. And when this anonymous arrow function gets invoked here, then it will run the alert. Okay, so inside functions, we can pass in a function as an argument. All right, still stuff that we learn and we know and we've seen all over the place. All right, now let's get a little bit more tricky here. Let's return a function from a function. Bum, bum, bum. Okay, so we've got a function here, and we're going to return a function. So how do I write an anonymous function, anonymous arrow function, that returns the number 1? Whoa. Okay, that looks super goofy. But let's break this down one piece at a time. If I remove this, all I have is a function that's about to return something, right? So I'm going to return a function out of this function that returns the number 1. Let's write this a different way. Let's write this with the function keyword. And this function is a function that returns a function that returns the number 1. Okay, these are the same exact thing happening here. So let's look at this. We've got a function called getOneFunc that returns an anonymous function that returns the number 1. So this is the same exact thing that's happening here. We've got a function called get1. Now remember, to the right of the arrow is what's being implicitly returned out of this function right here. So what is being implicitly returned? A function, just like this. And this function implicitly returns the number 1. So what happens if I say get 1 and I invoke it one time? What's going to be returned right here? And let me do this since we're going to keep everything clean here. I'm going to ask the question here, and then you can answer in a thread. What gets returned here? Yeah, a function gets returned, right? The whole function. Nice. This is the function that gets returned out of this call right here. So let's look at this again. Get1 is a function. When we invoke this function right here, what is it returning? It's going to return a function definition. And that's what this is right here. So then what happens if we do that? Let's stay on the same answer thread inside here. What happens if we do this? Yeah, we're going to return the number 1. Okay? Because this, when you evaluate this piece of code right here, or when the JavaScript engine evaluates this piece of code, this evaluates down to this. So since this is essentially that right there, when you invoke that, it's going to return the number 1. So let's check this first one out here. And we get a function definition, just like we expected. Then when we run the second one, we get the number 1. Today's going to be all about what a function returns. Okay. Let's see. We can keep those up. Let's make this a little bit more fun. Let's add some arguments, some parameters in here. All right, we're going to write a function called multiply. And this is going to be an arrow function that returns a function. Each of these are going to take in a number, and the inner function is going to multiply those two numbers together. All right? So looking at this, if we run multiply, and we pass in 5, and we pass in 20, what is going to be returned? $100, yeah, exactly. You can answer down here too. Not everybody probably has this thread pulled up. So when we pass this in, when we pass in 5 here, this gets replaced with 5. When we pass in 20 here for y, this gets replaced by 20. So running this line of code gives us 100. Let me change those back, and we'll run this. We'll see 100. If we were to do 20 and 20, we would see 400. All right, we can take this a step further because this function multiply that is taking in a number and returning this function here is actually a really cool function. We can use this function here to create multiplier functions. What I mean by that is if we say const multiply by 5, we can pass in, we can invoke multiply one time and pass in 5. And this is going to return to us a function that looks like this. But remember, x received the value 5. So the function that's returned out of this now is a multiply by 5 function. So now on the fly, we've created a brand new function called multiply by 5 just by invoking this one time. So the value of multiply by 5 is this function here. So when we call multiply by 5 and pass in 100, we get 500. Okay, we pass in 100 right here for y, and it returned the value of 5 times 100. We can do it again. Let's try multiply by 5. We'll pass in 30, and we expect to see 150. So now we have a function that is creating a brand new multiplier function for us. So we've got multiply by 5 that we can pass in any number, and it will multiply that number by 5. What if we wanted to make a multiply by 10? Well, all we have to do is use our cool multiply function and pass in the number 10. Now we've got a multiply by 10 function that when we invoke this function with 30, we're going to multiply 30 by 10. So really, really cool pattern if we want to make dynamic or make functions dynamically. All we have to do is return a function out of a function. So we're going to combine that knowledge that we just learned with something that we already know about. Higher order functions. Who can tell me what a higher order function is? These are examples of higher order functions, but what are they? Yeah, here we go. A function that takes a callback function as an argument. Yep, perfect. It's a function that takes in a function as an argument. This is a really great question, and it looks like we've got some good answers here. Yeah, the idea is that we're writing this to make these dynamic functions on the fly. Looks like we had some good answers there. Thank you. Okay. Higher order functions are functions that take in functions as an argument. So for example, we have our array methods that are higher order functions like .map, .reduce, .for each, most of these are going to be higher order functions, right? So if we have an array and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's just easiest to do it with numbers here. I know that's always my example. Array.map. We pass in a function here, and we can explicitly or implicitly return something from our one-line arrow function. So if we pass in num, let's say num times 2, then our result is going to be our array doubled. What's cool about this is we can define our function outside of the map and just pass in our function like this. And we're going to get the same result. I'm not sure if you've seen this pattern yet, but that is a thing where if you have a higher order function, you can pass in a function definition instead of an anonymous function. Okay, so let's combine all of this together. And when we combine all of this together and consider that the functions that we can pass in to functions in React can be components, then we get higher order components. Higher order components are components that take in another component as, we'll say, one or more components as arguments and return a new component. Okay, so we're combining higher order functions that take in functions with this pattern here, which is a function that returns a function. So they're not quite the same as higher order functions in that they have to return a new component. Whereas this, higher order functions don't have to return a function, they just take in a function. So we have to combine higher order functions with this pattern here, and the component that is returned is a carbon is, we'll say, usually a carbon copy of the passed in component with some added functionality. So inside our higher order component, we've got our reusable logic that we're trying to share with other components, right? So we write a function that takes in one or more components as an argument or as multiple arguments, and it's going to return a brand new component. And we're going to create, like this, we're going to create components dynamically, just on the fly. We're going to be creating brand new components and rendering those brand new components. Let's see. So let's jump into Code Sandbox here. Here's this mix, which I really like, before I exit out of here. Okay, let me see if there's any questions before we jump into here. When is it not a carbon copy that is returned? That's a good question. So we're going to see an example of that today. Let me think. So we're always going to return a new component. Yeah, I'm going to take this away. Thank you for asking. It is a carbon copy of a component that we passed in, usually with some added functionality. Today's project won't have added functionality. Today's project is going to be the other use case where it's conditional rendering. So the two kind of use cases for higher order components are adding functionality adding shared functionality, or conditionally rendering one piece of data or another, or one component or another. Okay, we're going to go to Code Sandbox. So everybody open up a new Code Sandbox. Actually, yeah, open up a new Code Sandbox. We'll take a break, and then we'll come back and build our first higher order component. Okay, come on back to your seats. And we're going to open up our new sandboxes again. And okay. All right, so let's start this out like this. For right now, we're going to keep everything in our index.js file so we can see the different pieces moving together here. Conceptually, I think higher order components are so hard because of because it's hard to follow the flow of the component from where you wrote it to it being passed into the higher order component and the brand new component that is being returned out of that higher order component. So hopefully working in this file here will kind of help us see what is going on. So we're going to create a title component, and it takes in some props, and it's going to return this title here. And then let's go ahead and render title right here. So take a second to write out your title component and render it here. Let me start a live session. Notifications. Let's just fix that. Okay. All right. Wow, everybody is trying to edit, huh? No, editing. I see you, Jay. Sorry, I need to remember to toggle those. All right. So I don't like that it changes colors on me when I do this. Oh well. We've got our title component. We've got our title component defined here. Let's write a subtitle. And you're probably guessing what goes inside here. It's going to be this H2, like that. And then we're going to render subtitle. Like that. All right, so now we want to write our higher order component. And what we're going to do is we're going to take in one of these two components, and we're going to transform the text that's being rendered here into all uppercase. It's going to be really hard to do it with this text hard-coded as this is. So instead of hard-coding this text here, let's pass in a text prop. And remember, if you pass in a string as a prop, you don't have to use curly braces. You can just pass it straight in as a string like that. So for title, I'm going to pass in text there, and I'm going to say props.text. And that gets us our title back. And then for subtitle, I'm also going to pass in a text. These will need to be named the same. for our higher order component to look at the text prop and transform it to uppercase. This is too long. Let's do something shorter. Yay for HOCs. And we're going to render props.text. All right, if I wanted to, I could write on here const uppercase text equals props.text dot to uppercase and then I wouldn't have to render props.text here. I could render uppercase text. And I've transformed my text that I passed in here to uppercase. Now I could do the same exact thing for my subtitle. And instead of passing in props.text, I just pass in uppercase text. Now it's important to understand that even though pretty much everything is the same here, we do have a difference of the type of header that we're displaying. Otherwise, we would just do another title, right? If they were both displaying H1s, we know how to make reusable components like that. These components are a little bit different in that they're displaying an H1 versus an H2. So we do need the different components for this situation. But we do have this that's the exact same line as what's happening down here. So this is a situation that we can say, hey, we don't need to duplicate this code. We can pull this out and build a higher order component, pass in title, pass in subtitle, and extend the passed in components functionality with this to uppercase function here. So I'm going to pull this out of here. And we don't know what's going to go inside there yet. Let's just say, let's just keep these props.text. All right. So now we're going to write our HOC. There is a naming convention for higher order components. First of all, one rule with higher order components, they never get rendered like this. Since you never render them inside JSX like this, they start with a lowercase letter. And usually, especially if you're extending functionality, they start with the word with. You can look up Medium articles on this. There's a whole definition that inside functional programming paradigms. There's a whole list of how to name these types of functions, and yeah, you can read about that if you so desire. It's not something that I would worry too much about, though. We're going to call this with uppercase. And okay, so what does a higher order component look like? Remember, it's a function. It's going to take in one or more components as an argument, and it's going to return a component. So it's a function like this that is going to return a component. Well, we can write a component like this, right? This is technically a component right here, just an anonymous component. You didn't know you could do anonymous components, did you? Haha, you're learning something new today. So it's a function that takes in a component. We'll call this passed component. It's a component that's passed in. And it's going to return an anonymous component here. Now, components take in props, right? So this anonymous component can take in some props. We'll come back to this. This step is important and gets confusing the first time you see this. All right, so here's our component that we're returning. We're going to pass in the same props.text prop into this component here. So we're going to have props.text available to us. So we can create our uppercase text with props.text. Then we're going to return whatever, we're going to return some JSX. It's going to be whatever component we passed in that also receives a text prop with the value of uppercase text. All right? So this component right here, remember, this is a component. This is just an anonymous component that's being returned out of this function. This anonymous component will be passed some props, and it'll be passed props.text. We're going to uppercase that text, and then from this component, this anonymous component returned from with uppercase is going to render whatever component we pass in and pass in our uppercase text here. So now what do? We don't want to render this anymore. We don't want to render title or subtitle because that just gets us this, right? What we want to do is we want to invoke with uppercase, and we're going to pass in title. Now, what does this return? If I invoke with uppercase and I pass in title, what gets returned from that function call? Almost, not quite. A component, yes. It's not the title component. It's that anonymous component that is inside this here. So we're not returning title. We could easily return title. We could just say return our past component, and then it just is, it's still a higher order component, but not doing anything. But instead of returning our passed in component, we're returning a brand new component and doing some stuff inside that component. So we have a brand new component. So we can take that component and we can capture that value in a new variable. So we're going to say angry title because we've capitalized all the letters. And it's angry, it's yelling at you. Now watch this. Ready for the magic part? We're going to, instead of displaying title up here, we're going to display angry title. And there it is. It's so cool. Oh, I love higher order components. Okay, give me your best emoji for how you feel right now when you see this code happening. By the way, I expect most of these to be like, what the heck is going on? Yeah, these are really good. Nice. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. Dylan's drinking the Kool-Aid. Okay, let's take a look at what just happened. Because view, view. Because we accomplished what we wanted to accomplish, but it's really hard to see how the heck we did that. So maybe let's work backwards. We just went one direction. Let's reverse the flow and think about this backwards. What is angry title? Let's go find angry title in our file. Okay, here's angry title. Angry title is the value for angry title is whatever this is returning here. So this is the part where things just get a little confusing because we're thinking, oh, this is a higher order component, this is advanced, I don't know what's going on, my brain is all in jumbles. This is just JavaScript, okay? You need to take a deep breath, look at this specific line of code. This is a function. It's got an argument passed in. When we invoke functions that return something, then this line of code will evaluate down to whatever is returned out of that function. Okay, so we know that. We know that when we invoke a function like this, we're going to have some value returned, and we're going to capture that value with angry title. And then that's where angry title is up there. So let's go look at what with uppercase returns. All right, so we have with uppercase, we've got this function in the arrow function there. So we know that with arrow functions that don't have a body, whatever's to the right of the arrow is implicitly returned from that function, right? So here's our function call. Here's our function. This is the return value of that function. So we could basically go copy, paste, right? Now, the one thing is we don't know what pass component is because that comes in as the argument. But we know that we passed in title, so we could just say title. And it still works. So this right here is the value, is what this line of code is going to evaluate down to. This is a function that takes in some props. We're passing props.text to this function. So we're going to take in our text, props.text, we're going to uppercase it, and we're going to render another function and pass that text on through. Pass the uppercase text through to that other function. So when we do this with uppercase, pass in title, title gets passed in right there, pass component receives title. We know that title is looking for props.text, right? So when we render our passed in function inside our HOC, we need props.text. So there's props.text. So we pass our uppercase text to right here. Okay, one last time. This is a function call that's receiving this anonymous component. So angry title is going to capture whatever anonymous component is returned out of this. When we render angry title, we pass in a text prop. That text prop comes in right here to this anonymous function. So we've got props.text, we're uppercasing the text, and we're passing that uppercase text down as prop. So when we pass in title, title goes in right here. And this line of code is rendering whatever component gets passed in here with the text prop passed to it. So watch this. we can do const angry subtitle and pass in our subtitle component. Now, instead of rendering subtitle, we can render angry subtitle. Get our angry subtitle right here. Okay, take a few minutes, or take a little bit right. Let's see. Let's just move those a little bit closer. Okay, so there's all the code that we need on the screen. Take a look at that. Ask whatever question you can come up with. What's confusing? What looks weird about this whole situation? Let's just have like a little Q&A real fast about higher order components here. We already have some questions coming in. Yeah, let me just see. We can build up all these because there were some questions back here. Gil asks, does it matter if the HOC is above or below their functions? We couldn't do, since this is an arrow function and not with the keyword function here, then we can't do this, because then we don't know what with uppercase is. But what we're going to see in just a minute is that we're going to write our higher order component in its own separate file, import that at the top of the file, and then you won't have any issues. So for when it's all in one file, yes, the order matters. Title can't be down here because then you don't know what title is. So for this example, order matters. For what you're going to be doing today and what we're going to finish our lecture at today, it won't matter because we're just going to import everything at the top of the file. And we'll break all of these out into their own files. And then we'll do this in the same file that we want to render it. So good question. Right now, yes. Later on, it won't matter. Okay. Why does the returned component equal unknown in the React DevTools? Oh yeah, let's go look at the React DevTools. Why doesn't it return angry title? Is it because the component? Yep, that's exactly right. The component is anonymous. So let's see how this looks in the DevTools, and we're going to tie this into React hooks. Of course, everything ties into React hooks, right? Okay. Yeah, look at this here. So we've got this unknown component thing here. And it's wrapping around our title component. So your assumption is exactly correct. It's because it's technically an anonymous component, and we're just capturing that value with angry title. So how does this tie into hooks, you may ask? Well, let's take a look at this real quick. This is a good point to read this. If you go to the hooks documentation, and this is a fantastic video introduction to watch. Come down and you look at the motivation section. Why are there even hooks? What made the React team go in some room together and say, we need to write hooks? There's three pieces of three motivating factors here. It's hard to reuse stateful logic between components. Complex components become hard to understand. Classes confuse both people and machines. Those are the three motivating factors behind a lot of what's being rewritten today. This one in particular I want to look at because it has to do with higher order components, as you can see right here. So let's just read this real quick, and then we'll go back to our lesson. React doesn't offer a way to attach reusable behavior to a component, for example, connecting it to a store or other things. If you've worked with React for a while, you may be familiar with patterns like render props and higher order components that try to solve this. We've been talking about that today, right? The reason we have higher order components is to reuse stateful logic between components. There's not another way to do what we're trying to do with higher order components. But these patterns require you to restructure your components when you use them, which can be cumbersome and make code harder to follow. Duh. Is anybody following this perfectly yet? Probably not. Makes code, it's cumbersome, makes code harder to follow. If you look at a typical React application in React DevTools, you'll likely find wrapper hell of components surrounded by layers of providers, consumers, higher order components. We're looking at this right now, like literally, as we're reading this. We're looking at this weird wrapper-ness thing happening in the React DevTools. So if you look at a typical React application in React DevTools, it's wrapped by components surrounded by layers of providers, consumers, or higher order components or other abstractions. While we can filter them out in DevTools, this points to a deeper underlying problem. React needs a better primitive for sharing stateful logic. So all the confusion, everything that you're seeing both in the code itself and in the DevTools has been considered by the React team, and they have released now a solution for this craziness here. Again, that's why I want to stress to you that we're going to see this pattern for still quite a while, and you need to know the pattern exists and you need to recognize it, but you don't need to memorize it and get really good at higher order components. I would spend more of my energy on hooks than I would on really getting deep into higher order components. Okay, really great question. What else we got? Can you show how to pass only certain props instead of all of them? Let's see. Oh, yeah, doing this kind of thing. Yeah, let's talk about destructuring, but let me see if there's anything else higher order component related before we get into that. So the reason to do this is if you have a function you want to use a lot, kind of like the equivalent of mix in and less. Yeah, that's a really good way to look at it. Especially strong pattern for complex render when you get a blank logic handling that you want to apply to a lot, broad swaths of the program. Yeah. We'll look at some really good examples of higher order components in just a minute here. Can you talk about common errors and gotchas in using higher order components? Let me think. I told you one, you'll never see anything like this with uppercase. If you make sure that you don't name your higher order component function with a capital, then you'll at least get errors if you try to actually render it. So you'll never see, you don't render higher order components. You invoke them and you render what's returned out of a higher order component, but not the higher order component itself. So one common mistake is to capitalize the first letter here, which could lead someone to think that they can render it up here. Even if this was capitalized, is capitalized, we're still going to get an issue. Functions are not valid as a React child. This is returning a function, not JSX. So one gotcha would be to name it with a lowercase letter up front, so you don't ever try to render it. Other gotchas are that they're really hard to reason about and write effectively. Can't really think of other things off the top of my head. Me trying to follow the data flow. Yeah, yeah. Oh, it's so true though. Okay. We're going to do render props. Later seems very close. I don't think we will. We'll see a small example of render props with router next week, but it's not in the way that we would normally write render props that they're talking about in here. So there are render props that we will see, but you won't learn really how to implement render props like we're learning how to implement higher order components. We opted to go with higher order components because you'll see that more in the field than you'll likely see render props. So we kind of had to make a choice. Which one do we show? And we decided to go with higher order components. Cool. Great questions. Chris has something here. How about when it goes wrong? Yeah, sorry, I can't really think of much more beyond what we've said. When you don't implement it correctly, you're going to notice it here. It's just not, your app's not going to work. So, yeah. All right, one more quick break. Then we will, we've seen the example of the with higher order component where we're extending the functionality. We're going to now look at a render example. I think we'll still call it with, but we're going to see the conditional rendering use case. So I'll see you back in 5 minutes. All right, my apologies. Had to take care of something real quick. Okay, let's check out Slack and see if we have any more questions that have come in. It was just you. It was still running when I got here. Come on. Cool. So let's take a look at a different implementation of a higher order component. I'm going to stop the live session here. We're going to save this and post this here. And we're going to start a new code sandbox. Perfect. And if you get some remnants of your old code sandbox, just refresh the page and it should go back to normal. There we go. All right, so open up a new sandbox and we're going to create a new directory called components. And we're going to, inside components, create a file called with conditional render.js. All right, this is, again, this is a component. It's not one that we render, but it is a component. So we do need to import React from React. This is, again, this is going to be our HOC. This is our higher order component. And we're going to say const with conditional render. Now this one's going to be a little bit, we're going to export one extra function out of this. But it's okay because of closure and scope. You can, sorry, not export, return. You can return 10 arrow functions on one line. It's your inner function. Your inner function will have access to every argument passed into every single function. So it's really your innermost function that is the important one. This one we're going to say, we're going to pass in a first component, which is going to return a function that takes in a second component. All right. This function is going to return a function, and this function is going to be our returned component. So just like before, we're going to pass in props, and it's an arrow function, and it's going to return some JSX, right? I'm going to save this and go live. Classroom, hide notifications, paste this into here. Oh, I never started the timer? Oh, that's funny. It probably was shorter than 5 minutes then. Yeah, that's what it was. It was shorter than 5 minutes. Okay, no limits. Again, we could do this, we could do 10 in a row. The important part with a higher order component is the last function returned, the innermost function, and because of closure and because of scoping, closure scope, this innermost function will have access to every single thing passed in here. Perfect. So let's do, let's go make first component and second component. So I'm going to make a new file called firstcomponent.js. And go ahead and build out your first component, just the skeleton structure for your first component. And let's just do 2 headers. First component is going to say, hi, I'm the first component. Okay, I'll pause there for a minute, and you can write out your first component file here. Now we're going to go just copy this whole thing, and let's make a new directory called second component. And we'll do second component like this. So we have first component rendering, hi, I'm the first component. Second component rendering, hi, I'm the second component. And of course, exporting, doing all the normal component things. All right, so what we want to do, go back to your with conditional render HOC, and we're going to wrap this return in an if statement. We're going to pass down, when we render this empty component here, this anonymous component, when we render this, we're going to pass in a prop called props.show first. All right, so it's going to be a Boolean, and we're going to wrap this return inside this if statement. So if this evaluates to true, if props.show first is true, we're going to return our first component. If this evaluates to false, we're going to return our second component, like this. Now we need to, of course, export default with conditional render. Awesome. Who wants to take a step? Well, let's do this. I want you to go into index.js, and you will, instead of rendering here, but let's before I let you loose on your own, let's do this. We're going to change this. We're going to change app to a class. And we're going to have state with show first on it. And don't forget to wrap this in render. Don't worry, I will let you, I'll give you a minute to catch up here. And we're going to have a button. Toggle components. All right, so change app to a class. It's got a state property called show first. It's got a button called toggle components. And this button, when you click it, it's going to run a function called this.toggle components. there we go. And all toggle components is going to do is run this dot set state and toggle show first. All right. So I'll pause here for a second. This is what we want our app component to look like. So go ahead and take a second to get app looking like this. And then I want you to implement, I want you to render the component that's created with our higher order component right here. And the idea is that when you click this button, it should render, when you first open up the app, it should render the first component. When you click this toggle components button, it will render the second component. So we're conditionally rendering different components based on what the value is right here. Okay. Sorry, I knew that this was going to be pretty challenging, and maybe I didn't. Obviously, I didn't give you guys quite enough to get you started on this. All right, so let's do this. Is there anyone that would be brave enough to help me accomplish this goal? I can invite you to edit, and you can edit live for us right here. Would anybody like to try that? Yeah, this is easy to do without an HOC. And again, this is just an example of a small, simple app to explain the concept that for a complicated thing. So we normally wouldn't use this complicated thing for this small example of an application. Yeah, Vladimir, let's have you jump on here. And let me see if I can find you in my list. Just man, okay. You are an editor, I believe. And then let me, if you want to, let's see. Would you like to unmute as well and chat, or I can't find you in the list? Oh, there you are. Okay, if you'd like to chat, you can, I'll make you a co-host and you can unmute yourself, I believe.
I'm unmuted now. Guys, can you hear me?
Oh, you're on, but my volume's down. Try again.
So everybody can hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay, should I share my screen or actually just
you should just be able to type right inside.
Okay. Basically, when I took a look at this HOC, we will be returning a component which will get us props a value that should be true or falsy. Truthy or false, actually. So that's actually pretty easy to implement, but we got to do what? We got to import our, and did you do a default or like a normal? Okay, you did a default. Okay.
What's the question?
Nothing, like, it's cool. With conditional from, yeah, my typing is bad.
It's the hardest thing to type in front of everyone.
Yep. So that's what we actually got. We got a with conditional thingy. Well, we kind of need to get both of these to import the other two components first, because they will be the parameters for the our with conditional. Second component. Therefore, what I could do is actually do like a constant, I guess, to show, and it will equal with conditional, since this will return to us a React component, and just pass in first and second. And we know that this thing to show, it takes as props a truthy or a falsy value. Therefore, we're going to do what? That's right, to show, and the truthy or falsy value, actually forgot how you named it. Props.show first. Yeah, easy. Show first, this.state.show first.
Cool.
Yay. And there, like, we actually did it.
Yeah, got it. That's so awesome. Okay, everybody, round of applause. Emoji love for Vlad. That was so good. That was amazing. All right, I'm going to revoke editing powers. Great job, man. That was really good. Yeah. I don't know what this means. Cool. So let me walk through what he did, and I'll show you guys how we accomplished this goal. So remember, just as Vlad was telling us, the idea here is the trick to HOCs is that this is going to return a component, right? So if we look at our higher order component here, we can see that this is returning a component. And what is that component rendering? It's either rendering first component or second component. Totally dependent on this prop that gets passed down to this anonymous component. Well, this anonymous component is exactly what toShow is. So toShow right here is this anonymous component. So when we render toShow and we pass in props.show first, it receives props.show first right here. If in index.js, if this.state.show first is true, let's look at what happens in our toShow. Remember, this is our toShow component. If this is true, it's going to render our first component. What is our first component? It's the component passed into the first invocation of with conditional render. So our first invocation is first, our first component. I'm going to rename these to just match the component name, just so we don't get that confused. So we're passing in first component, which is this component here that renders, hi, I'm the first component. We pass that in as the first argument inside with conditional. We're also going to call this the same thing. Okay. So with conditional render takes in that first component here as the first argument. Then if props.show first is true, it will render first component. When we click the button and we toggle this.state.show first to false, that gets passed in to this component toShow, which goes into props. Props.show first is now false, so we never hit this return, we hit this return instead. And our second component, which is our second component, gets rendered here. That is a higher order component flow. Wherever you want to render that inner component that's inside your higher order component, you import your higher order component function into that file. You invoke it and pass in the components that you want to pass in, and then you capture that value in a variable, and then you render that variable. So again, toShow is this innermost component here that's being returned. That's why we can receive props. When you render a component and pass down some props, it receives those props in that function right here. This highlighted code, we could literally copy and paste that highlighted code right here, because that's what's being returned right there. All right, let's take a look at here to see if we have any more questions. This worked as well. Why would it be less effective? That's a good question. I think this is just the pattern that we see. We'll see this pattern in a few libraries that we're going to use, and we'll see this pattern with middleware that you'll use with Redux and that you'll use in Node. So it's just a pattern thing. We really could just do invoke it once, pass it in two components like this. But this is just how you will see it in the real world. All right, if you had multiple views, say you had 5+ views and could show conditionally, it'd be pretty lengthy HOC to pass in 5 components. Do you recommend doing it that way still, or is there a more elegant solution? I think at that point, you wouldn't really use an HOC. You'd find a different way to do. How would I do that? 5+ views we wanted to show conditionally. That's when you would bring in like a router and use subroutes. And instead of relying on JavaScript like this to show something conditionally, you rely on the URL. And whatever the URL is at, that's what you show conditionally. I'm trying to think. I mean, literally, you could just do 5 more of these arrow functions, right? Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how I would, if I had to do that with an HOC, what would I do? I might make a dynamic HOC out of an HOC and pass that into an HOC and just have higher order component inception to the nth degree, maybe. Ah, yes, let's cover local storage real quick. That was a perfect segue. So for today's assignment, we need, instead of checking props.show first, we're going to run a login page. And let's see, so let's go back to index. Let me save all my things here. And I'm going to fork off of this. Let me close down my live session. Fork off of this. And what I'm going to do is, instead of the button to toggle this here, we're going to put an input. And we're going to have input text. Okay, so build your input text, and have a value of this dot state dot input text, and on change this dot handle changes. So build out your input like this, and then we'll build out our handle changes function. All right, so let's make handle changes. And this is going to take in an event and run this dot set state. We only have the one input, so I'm just going to hard code input text, set our state with event dot target dot value. Okay, go ahead and get caught up there. If you'd like to, just follow. Here's the live version. Perfect. So Now we've got an input. And what we're going to do is when we submit this input, let's go ahead and make a button called sign in. And on click is going to invoke this dot sign in. What we want to do is set whatever value is here into our local storage when we sign in. Then our higher order component is going to, oh, I didn't share the link. Must not have copied that link very well. There we go. There, sorry about that. Oh, I'm awesome. So what we're going to do is in sign in, when we click sign in, we're going to take the value that's in our input, add it to local storage. Then inside our higher order component here, instead of checking for props.show first, we're just going to check for our local storage. And I'll show you how that works. This takes in an event. We run event.prevent default. Then we're going to call local storage, and we're going to set an item to local storage. All right, so you've got this. This is coming from the window object on the DOM. So you can do window.local storage, and that still calls the function, or you can shortcut it with local storage. Local storage is an object with a few methods on it. We have set item, we have get item, we have delete item. Those might be the only three. We can look it up in a minute. So we're going to, when we log in, we're going to set an item on local storage. And the way you set an item, this is kind of sort of like JSON / JavaScript objects. It's a little bit different though. You're going to pass in two values to this function. The first value is the key. The second value is the value. So we'll just say user. And then we're going to pass in whatever we have in this.state.input text. So this is what our sign-in is going to look like. It's going to, when we click this button, it's going to take whatever text we have inside here, set an item on local storage to the key user. So let's type in something, username. I'm going to click sign in. Now we're going to open up our DevTools to find our local storage. This is like a mini database within our browser. You can find it in application here under local storage. So nothing's here. You have to open this up and click on this. And there is our user with username. So we can say something else and sign in, and it updates our user to our new value. So now instead of passing in show first, we're just going to go ahead and delete show first here. We're just going to render our toShow component. Now, inside our rendering, we're going to say if local storage dot get item, and you pass in just one argument, the same string, the string of the key that we're looking for right here. So we pass in that string, and you can see already that this is returning true, truthy. This is returning a value, so it's truthy. So we're returning our first component. Now this gets a little bit tricky if you don't have like some kind of logout button. If you want to show the other component, so if you have an item in user in local storage, then you want to show your posts, right? That means your user has logged in and you want to show your posts. But if you want to get back to your login page that you're going to build today, you need to go into your local storage here, application, drop down local storage, click on it there, and you can clear all, or you can highlight it and just click delete selected. Then you have to refresh the page, unfortunately, and now we're showing the second component because this did not return a value. This returned undefined, which is falsy, so we skipped first component here. Now watch, if we type something in and hit sign in, we're not updating the view, so we're not actually toggling what we're showing. There's two ways to handle this. You can refresh, and this will run again, or we can do something which is a little bit dirty, but kind of not, because you have to refresh anyways. You can just run force render, I think. Is it react.force render? Let's see. Let's clear out our local storage and refresh the page. So we want to see second component, which is the login component. Okay, let's find out what force render. React.component. Force update, that's what it is. Force update. Someone probably told me that. Okay, so force update. Maybe it's react.force update. Oh, component.force update. I've never done this before, so app.force update. Let's try it. So if we clear out our local storage, we want to see second component, because that means we don't have anything here. Like that, click that. Okay, so maybe the force, I don't know how to make the force update work. It's something you're not ever supposed to do. So you're basically going to have to refresh the page. We'll see the first component. We'll clear this again, refresh. So we can do a window dot refresh, like that. And I think that will do it. Okay, so if we refresh, we don't have user. So we're going to sign in. What is that? Oh, I'm failing here. Location.reload, thank you. Window.location.reload. That's the one. This is not something that you normally do as a React developer, so. Okay, this will work. We've got user in here, so we need to clear out user. I'm really sorry that step gets really tedious and annoying, but it's just what we have to do at this point. Click sign in, it re-renders the page. There we go. So that is our walkthrough with local storage, a little sign-in form, and yeah, let me see if there's other questions that came in. Does get item accept key value pairs? No, it only takes the keys as the first argument, and then, oh, does get item. No, it only takes in the key. Yeah. Thank you for helping on the answer there. So with local storage, oh, dot clear is another method. We'll clear out all your local storage. With local storage, if you ever need to, when you get the item, if you ever need to use the value here, which is quite often, then you will need to run JSON stringify. You'll need to parse the JSON that you get out of here. Because this returns JSON, and your JavaScript application can't technically read that. So you do have to parse. Since we're just looking for this to be truthly or falsely, we're not concerned about that right now. But if you ever needed to use the actual value, you would need to parse that value that you get back from there. Thank you for pointing that out. That's a great point. All right. Why aren't you supposed to do that way using forced update? Let's see if we talk about it. Normally, you should try to avoid all uses of forced update and only read from this.props and this.state to memory. So, yeah, according to the docs, try to avoid all uses of force update. Basically, React is really good at knowing when it's supposed to re-render. And if you're doing something that you need to run force update, you're doing something wrong. Now, for your project today, we will be doing things the wrong way. That's intentional to teach you higher order components before we teach React Router, before we teach other ways to solve this problem. So with the knowledge that we have at this point in the React curriculum, we don't know how to do this the right way. And so we're just going to force the page to refresh so that it checks local storage, and it will toggle this for you. But normally, if you're using this type of a technique, whether it's force update or location dot reload, then you're probably doing things wrong. And we are. I recognize we're doing things the wrong way. So don't ever do this again, but do this just to learn the higher order component stuff from today. Great question. Oh, that's awesome. That was absolutely perfect. I put this function, clear local storage. Yeah, you can do this as a logout button if you'd like. So just add one more button to your posts page with logout. It will clear the local storage and reload your page for you. So that's a really good idea. Then it will reload with the login page. Thank you for that. Just waiting. See if we have any more questions. I am gonna take the next 10 or 15 minutes if you'd like to stay on to document that last code sandbox that we made with comments. And so if you'd like to hang out with me while I do that, I'll kind of talk out loud as I do that as well. You are welcome to do that. Code sandbox in the chat. Yeah, let me grab the last one that we did. Save all the things. Here is the last one. And I'll grab the other one that we made that used the props. So I'll grab the one that we did props.show first in here that we finished as well. So would it be better to set the local storage to the state in this case? Yeah, you can do that. The problem is that if we set it to state, so there is a way around this. You can, if you want to set up for your state here to handle your login, pass that down here. You can do that there. The project I think I'm going to rewrite the project to do that. I like that a lot better. The project for today has you do all the logic inside with conditional rendering. But we could solve this problem if we did the logic in app and ran set state. And on component did mount, it would check local storage. Yeah. Unfortunately, we're not at that point now. So I kind of built this out, how your instructions have it in the project for today. But yeah, I'm glad that you thought of that, because then that is a way to solve the wrong things we're doing. Perfect. Let's check this out here. Where is our to-do app? Okay, day 3. Day 3 README is all about higher order components. There is step-by-step long list of tasks. So this is pretty hand-holdy. That's on purpose. It's, again, I don't need you to master higher order component patterns. I just want you to see an implementation and recognize what it is, be able to recognize it in the future. So this is very written out, what to do, what to write. Not 100% completely, but pretty explicit steps here. One last thing before we sign off. We've kind of let a pattern sneak into the cohort a little bit, where, let me stop sharing, and we can have a quick heart-to-heart. So there's been a little bit of a pattern that I want to try and stop as soon as we can, and that is that there's a lot of points that I see you guys reaching out reaching out for help without really asking a good question, stating what issue you run into. I don't know if you've taken 20 minutes to try and figure out a problem, but usually at this point things just get so frustrating that I would imagine that a lot of the 20-minute rule is getting kind of passed over, and we just kind of get stuck on a piece of code. We're like so frustrated because this stuff is so hard, and we just reach out immediately. So I want to just reiterate that for your own good, for your own learning and growth and experience, that 20-minute rule is so important. Make sure you are taking that 20-minute rule to try and figure out what the problem is and do some searching to try and find it, to find a solution. Then, at 20 minutes, you hopefully have a pretty good grasp of what the problem is and can ask a good question in the help channel, or reach out to your PM and ask a good question to your PM. So I'd love to see a little bit more when you're reaching out for help. I'd love to see a little bit more of asking a good question and explaining your problem, instead of just, I don't know where I'm stuck, jump on the Zoom and help me. That's not going to help you. You're going to grow a lot more if you can articulate the question. Now, that being said, if you go through the 20 minutes and you just have no idea what the problem is, then please reach out to your PM. I don't want anyone to go past that 20 minutes just totally confused and not ask a question because you don't know what's going on. So if you're at that point, absolutely, reach out to your PM, ask for help, tell them you're really sorry, you would love to articulate a question to them, but you just don't know where you've gone wrong. And then we can come in and help you. But 20 minutes is so important as you're going through this program. That's where most of your growth will come. Your growth isn't going to come by writing correct code. Your growth will come by writing bad code and learning why it's bad and learning the solution. All right? So take that 20 minutes, and take it for your own sake so that at the end of this program, you will have reached your full potential. You guys are awesome. I'll see you tomorrow if you're jumping off now. Otherwise, let's hang out, and I'll share my screen again. And let's go to this last component here, or this last code sandbox here. Okay, so where do we want to start? Let's start in our app. So this is our higher order component. It returns an anonymous component which gets set as the value of to show. Okay, and we know that to show is, therefore, to show is a component that we can render. Okay, does that make sense? So this is our higher order component right here. This higher order component returns an anonymous component which gets set as the value of toShow. Therefore, toShow is a component that we can render in the JSX. So that's what's happening on this line here. We can also say we pass in first component and second component because the HOC renders one of, oh, what happened? One of those components. Yeah, the HOC renders one of those components based on what's in local storage. Perfect. So this, that explains that line of code. This is kind of a pretty complicated line of code, and obviously it takes a lot of explanation there. Render the component that is created with our HOC right here. We'll just call this to show. So render the component, aka to show, that is created with our HOC. Right here. All right. So sign in. This function sets a user item to local storage for our HOC to check and render the correct component. That looks good for this. Let's go into with conditional render. This is our HOC. This can be a confusing point too, knowing which file is our HOC and looking at this and saying, okay, is to show our higher order component? No, it is with conditional render is the higher order component. So that can be a little bit confusing. This is our HOC. Yay! It takes in two components and returns an anon component. We can pass props to show if we want, and we would have access to those props here. Now, this HOC will check to see if there is a user item in local storage. If that was like 3 words combined into one. If there is a user item in local storage, render first component. Then we'll say pretty much the same thing, but if there is not a user item in local storage, render second component. Okay, save that there. Let's just close this. So we've got our documentation there. We've got it here. Is there, for any of you who stuck around, is there any other spot that you think needs more explanation? Is there a way to number the steps? It just, I guess we could number it with how we built it today. We kind of jumped. This is the hard thing with React components is you jump around so much. And it's really easy in CodePen in Josh's class because you just have all of your files right there on one page. And so you can be like, it's a linear flow of steps. With React, it's not a linear flow. But let me just do this. At the bottom, we'll say steps to recreate this app. Let's do comment block instead. Okay, steps to recreate this app. 1, we created HOC file and skeleton component with 2 components being passed in. We created that, then we created the 2 components to be rendered. Number 3, inside the HOC, we built the if logic for rendering one or the other component in index.js or app.js usually. In our app component, import the HOC and the 2 components that will be passed into it. Set the create a new const to capture the value of the invoked HOC, invoke the HOC, and twice, which is called currying. We didn't mention that today, but that's what it is. And pass in the two components. Render the new const that now has the value of the anonymous component returned by the HOC if the anon component needs props, pass props. In here too, we created the button and all those things, but that can really be done anywhere. Like before here, before you pass in props, you just need to have whatever value to pass in. So yeah, that can just kind of be plugged in anywhere. These are the steps to recreate the higher order component flow. Okay, any last questions before we sign off for the day? Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yes, I have that saved. We're not on live, we'll stop our live session. Okay, there we go. You guys have a wonderful day, and thanks for sticking around, and have fun with your higher order components.